Marty Fahncke, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you on. You're a seasoned marketer with well over 30 years of experience in growing and scaling businesses, 20 years of experience in mergers and acquisitions, and in this time you've actually helped businesses scale to over $1 billion in revenue, executed over $450 million in mergers and acquisition transactions, and you and your partners are actively acquiring businesses across various industries, including consumer goods, SaaS, health and wellness, e-commerce, just to name a few. You are offering your expertise as an M&A advisor, both on the sell side and buy side, which I'd love to explore. And the fact that you are actually an advocate of acquiring businesses, and you have developed well over 230 different funding strategies for acquiring businesses without depleting hard-earned cash reserves. I'm curious though, Marty, first off, I love this idea of potentially growing or scaling businesses through acquisition. Particularly interested because some of the stats I was looking at, given in the B2B space, would indicate that we're facing significant headwinds, if I could put it that way. Some of the stats reveal that 72% of B2B companies report longer sales cycles compared to previous years. Marketing costs have increased by 47% in the past year for B2B brands. 63% of B2B leaders cite economic uncertainty as their top growth challenge, and only 28% of B2B companies achieve revenue growth targets through organic means. Quite some significant challenges there. Before we dive into growth strategies, I'm curious about your own journey. Marketing is great in itself, but making the pivot to merger and acquisition, at least in my mind, is quite a substantial change. What triggered that, and how did the Westbound Road, your company, actually come into being?
Yeah, sure. Acquisitions came to me accidentally. I had started a business with some business partners over 20 years ago, almost 25 years ago now. And we were able to grow it from very grassroots startup to doing about $1.5 million in revenue after about a year and a half. And very quickly, we did it in a kind of a splashy way, which got a lot of attention. We had it on television in the United States and Japan and Brazil and a few other places. And very quickly, we got approached by a company that said, "Hey, we would like to buy your company." And it wasn't our plan, but they offered us a very nice sum of money. And so we said, okay, and we sold the business. And so we only had it for a year and a half. And I thought, oh, that's easy. You just start up a business and then somebody comes along and offers you seven figures for it. Not quite that easy, but it doesn't have to be that difficult either. That led to a long path of both buy side and sell side mergers and acquisitions deals. And you talked about the headwinds that B2B are facing. And I had my second big transaction was I had a B2C company, and we were facing some headwinds. And we had a competitor who was a pretty fierce competitor. And one day I was talking to my CEO. We were a PE-backed firm at that time. We were backed by a private equity group. And I was talking to our CEO, and I'm like, "Hey, this is what's happening, and they're competing against us, and we're butting heads constantly." And he said, "Instead of competing with them, why don't we buy them?" And it didn't even occur to me, like at the beginning, even though I had just sold a business a couple of years earlier. He said, "Let's buy them." So I reached out to the owner and I said, "Hey, would you be interested in selling your business to us?" And he said, "Yeah, I would be. So let's talk." So we went through some negotiations, and we wound up acquiring his business on a very favorable terms. And so here's what's interesting, though, is that at the time, my business, this was a long time ago in e-commerce, but my business was doing about $1 million a year in revenue. His business was doing about $1.5 million a year in revenue. So you have $2.5 million a year in the two businesses. We combined forces. We acquired them, absorbed his team. I absorbed his customer base. I absorbed his inventory. And 2 years later, at the end of 2 years later, what do you think our annual revenue might have been?
Oh, north of two and a half, I would imagine.
Yeah. So you had $1 million business, $1.5 million business, it's $3.5 million. We put the two together. By the end of the second year, we did $30 million.
Wow.
$30 million. Would we have done that separately? No. We would have still been competing with each other. We would have been gouging each other in our marketing, and it was kind of the same market, right? So instead of fighting, we joined forces, and our combined forces, both from a market standpoint as well as a brain power standpoint, their team was really good. My team was really good. And together we were phenomenal. And so we had nearly a 10x increase in revenue because we joined forces and acquired their business rather than continue to compete with them. And so you talk about those headwinds in B2B. Is there a business out there that is something that you're competing with or is complementary to your business that already has a customer base? They already have a revenue stream. They already have a profit stream. And potentially acquiring them could be a lot easier than trying to figure out how to sell more of your services and products to another business.
Obviously, there's a lot of nuances to that, things you need to check for, which I'd love to dive into in a bit. But given your journey to date, what would you say is your personal area of strength?
My best area of strength?
Yep.
My best area of strength. So I love the creativity of a deal. I have often been told that I have the ability to create money out of thin air. And I love that. I can't always do it, but I love being able to look at a situation, look at a scenario and say, okay, here's something that's out of the box, that's not the norm, and figure out how to turn it into a successful enterprise or successful marketing campaign or successful acquisition, and have the sum be greater than its parts. So I love putting together great marketing deals, a marketing strategy, and I love putting together great acquisitions deals. And I love growing businesses. It's just a passion.
In that area of strength, what would you say is something that businesses don't know but should?
I'm not sure I know. You need some context for that question.
Oh, so in that area of using creativity to structure a deal, what would you say is something that businesses don't know but should?
Don't know but should. You know what? I think it's not about knowledge. I think it's more about risk management. I think that a lot of people in a lot of businesses, especially in the B2B space, are more interested in protecting their jobs than they are in being creative and making their jobs more successful. And so it's not so much about knowledge. I think a lot of people have the knowledge they need to be successful, but they maybe don't have the guts. And so you need to be able to take risks and know when to take action, and rather than being indecisive and letting the market overwhelm you.
I'd imagine, though, that at least in the B2B space, it would possibly fall to the founder or the CEO to initiate that level of risk, given that the others would be a little bit skittish about suggesting something that could go pear-shaped very easily. Would that be the case, or should we reframe how risk should be perceived, and is there an element of education that needs to occur within the organization, at least amongst the executive leadership within the organization?
Yeah, I think it depends on the organization and what the decision-making limitations are. One of the things that holds a business back that I've seen is that the CEO may be a bottleneck or a stranglehold. It's funny, I just did an interview with a client of mine 2 days ago, and she mentioned that her business had the most successful year it had ever had this last year. And coincidentally, she had taken more time off than she'd ever taken. Is there a correlation there? Yes, I believe there is. Oftentimes, a business owner or a CEO can be its own worst enemy, especially if they are they're focused more tactically than they are strategically. And putting decision making into the hands of the people who are on the front lines or who actually can make a difference can have a big impact on a business, and the speed and agility in which it can move. You again opened up this podcast talking about perceived headwinds. If you've got headwinds, it's even more important that you are efficient with the direction that you're going. Everybody should know what direction you're going. Everybody should be pulling the oars in the same direction, and everybody should have the ability to make the right decisions to get where you're going. And so if everything comes to you as the CEO and you're looking inward and being a little bit more conservative, then you may be the stranglehold that's holding your business back.
With this idea of risk, with market uncertainty, there's obviously a greater sense of trepidation and risk as well. You're suggesting that such market conditions could also hold opportunities. How would you suggest people view these conditions to be able to identify opportunities? You started out with talking about your own experience in acquiring a competitor. Not every company would necessarily have a competitor that's ready for a buyout. In which
I disagree. A competitor, maybe, but I disagree that I believe every company has the ability to acquire another business that will bolster their business substantially.
Certainly.
Because
Yeah.
there's several key areas you can look in your supply chain, up or down your supply chain. Who do you pay and who pays you? Who are your clients? Sometimes your clients make great acquisitions, and your vendors can make great acquisitions. And obviously your competitors can make great acquisitions. So there's always, if you actually sit down with a list, and we do this with our clients, okay, who's everybody you pay money to? They are a target. Who's everybody that pays you? They are a target. Who's everybody you compete against? They are a target. And who's everybody in an ancillary business or complementary business that they're not competitors, but if you join forces, you'd be a great strategic partnership. And those are targets for acquisition. So every business has the ability to acquire their way to increase revenues, increase profitability.
Okay, that helps frame things. I'm also curious, given the competitive nature of certain markets, and just for an example, let's take CRM or web design as a specific space. There's a lot of competitors in there. Obviously, education and being able to distinguish yourself from competitors is important. And I would imagine there's a fair bit of education required to achieve that. Would you also suggest, apart from looking at all those you pay money to or have transactions with, that perhaps building out a bit of a media arm in order to build out your brand would also be another way of looking at possible acquisitions?
Yeah, I suppose that could be good. Are you advocating with, I don't know, I guess clarify your question a little bit. I want to make sure I'm answering exactly.
Could we also think about unrelated spaces that could provide a benefit? And I'm thinking perhaps of Unsplash, which was created by, I think it was Code Crew, who created a repository for photographs and images that could be used for web design, etc. Not initially designed to make a profit, but became a very popular, drove an incredible amount of business to them in the long run. Would looking or thinking along such lines be appropriate as well, or are most businesses better off looking at their verticals and trying to find related businesses to acquire?
Yeah, that seemed like a different question than a media. I guess I was trying to clarify the media question you were asking. I apologize.
Sure. It's something like Unsplash could also be like a media arm, and another example might be HubSpot acquiring, I forget the media company that they acquired, but they did acquire a media company that has a very popular newsletter, continued to use that again to drive marketing for their own brand.
Okay, yeah, I get it. Yeah, 100%. So actually, we're working with a client right now who they are a digital hosting company. Okay, so they host websites and host media properties. They're in the process of acquiring a web design firm. Why? Because that's top of the funnel, right? Somebody's looking to have a new website built. Where are you going to have that website hosted? It makes sense to tie the two together. So you've got the media being the web design firm, the hosting company being the long term. And web design tends to be transactional, whereas hosting tends to be residual, right? Once somebody has a web property built out and they've got it hosted somewhere, they generally tend to not move it around very much. And so you've got the best of both worlds. So yeah, we're actually advising on a process just like that. Similar with CRM, as you mentioned specifically. A CRM company may look at acquiring we actually have a email list scrubbing service, list hygiene. Sorry, that's the way. So would a CRM company be interested in acquiring a list hygiene company so that they can have better list hygiene for their clients, their CRM clients, but B, people who are subscribing to list hygiene they probably need good CRM. So you've got a built-in marketplace there as well.
Certainly. Is there a framework, or are there certain signals that you would be looking for as you go through your potential list of acquisitions to find ones that stand out because they're perhaps a bit more attractive given their current circumstances as opposed to the rest?
Generally, that's information you don't find out until you're down the road a little bit. Now, sometimes you do see publicly information that might indicate that a business is open to being sold, where you might have financial difficulties, you might have health issues of the ownership team, There's a lot of kind of things that can trigger a sale. Disputes with partners is very common, that we see that a lot. If you see those signals in advance, obviously those are right for that conversation. Generally, though, you don't see those out until you begin conversations. And really, it's best to look at strategically what would make sense to bolt on to your business to achieve the goals you want to achieve, and then reach out to those businesses. It's really interesting how when you reach out to a company, and B2B professionals know this more than anybody, you reach out to a company to sell them something, there's a big wall of resistance, right? They know you're reaching out to try and sell them something. Your objective is to take money out of their wallet in exchange for your products and services. But what's interesting, when you reach out and say, I would like to give you money by buying or investing in your business, those walls drop pretty quickly. So you get a lot more response and a lot more interest. And then once you begin those conversations, then you can start to look for those signals. Flat revenues or flat profitability, and maybe they've been stagnant for a couple of years. You may not know that information until you actually dug in a little bit, because you may not have access to their financials if they're a private company. Those are just a few of the key things we see with regard to businesses that are ripe for acquisition.
My takeaway from that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, would be you really need to invest in networking and connecting with your suppliers and vendors pretty much from day one, so to speak, because you never know when the opportunities would arise for a potential acquisition and the growth as a result of that. Would that be a fair statement?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, without question. Your best opportunities will come to you because of a connection you've made with somebody, or a referral that somebody else triangulates, and hey, I've heard this is going on at this business, and maybe there's opportunity there, or things like that. So relationships are very key, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something that we talk about extensively in our work with our clients. Is that this whole thing, what you use to measure it are the numbers, right? The revenues, the multiples, the deals themselves, and all the numbers that go to them. But the reality is these things we're talking about are more relationship based. It's more about the relationship of the people doing the deals, the relationship of the businesses. When you do an acquisition, you've got to make sure that company culture is going to fit, that management is going to fit, and putting the two businesses together is the right thing to do for an acquisition. And then all of that has to do with relationships. When you talk about networking or things like that, yeah, that's absolutely critical.
In my mind, that brings up the idea that really we want to create experiences to build that relationship and the associated trust with it. For a lot of businesses, it can seem like really a bit of a grind, trying to get through the day, keep the business afloat, service your customers, etc. How would you suggest to business owners who haven't really invested too much into their relationships with their suppliers and vendors, etc., to kick things up a notch in order to stand out in the midst of all the other relationships that these folks have?
Whether you're interested in acquisitions or not, if you don't have good relationships with your suppliers, with your vendors, with your customers, with your team, that's a problem, right? I'll give you a tactic that is literally almost 100 years old, but it's something that I truly believe in. So there is a book out there called How to Win Friends and Influence People. And it is one of the classics of business advice, business literature, etc. I have read that book now multiple times, up to and including again just last year, and it continues to astound me at the wisdom that's in that quite dated book now, but yet the truths in it will never expire. Could it be that simple? Read How to Win Friends and Influence People as a start. Okay. And I highly recommend every business owner should read that at least once, and if not every couple of years, to remind them of the things that they should be doing to make their business successful, no matter what. Because again, business really is about relationships. And there are people who don't understand that, and the more you understand that, the better off and more successful you'll be.
Okay. I'd love to touch upon AI. It's being talked about a lot, but given especially tech space or even services space, AI is causing a level of disruption, especially I would say in the SaaS space, where previously millions were spent to develop a particular product, and now you can pretty much do it at incredibly low costs with the help of AI. Would you say that AI is making some companies more attractive as acquisition targets?
Oh, it absolutely is making some companies more attractive. It's also making some companies less attractive. A couple of examples. Obviously, we do a lot of work in the SaaS space, and AI is having a tremendous impact in that vertical. But I sold my very first AI related business
Hmm.
in early 20, let's see, when 20, let's see, Chat GPT came out October of 22, right? Or was that 21?
Thereabouts, yes, I
22.
believe.
22. Okay. So ChatGPT came out in 22. All of a sudden, everything was AI. All the VC money's flooding into AI, et cetera. I had a SaaS business that was AI driven
Hmm.
that had already been in existence for a couple of years and was profitable. It was a revenue generating, profitable SaaS business. And I had it on the market at that time for sale. And it was insane the level of interest that business got. We had hundreds and hundreds of people trying to buy that business because it was an AI tech business that was
Hmm.
already revenue generating and profitable, which is fairly rare. At the same time, I had a business that it was a B2B in the music licensing space
Hmm.
where they provided music licenses for marketing videos and things like that so that you weren't violating music copyrights when you create marketing materials. So they were a big B2B business in the licensing space at about that same time, and they were again a very nice business, nice revenues, nice profits, etc. But that business went from a valuation standpoint from a very nice value to almost nothing because the perception was that AI would put them out of business because people would just use AI generated music for their marketing needs. And that hasn't completely come true. However, the marketplace of potential acquirers were convinced AI is just, people will just say, I want a song that sounds like this and go create it and put it in my marketing piece. And we were actually that we watched that business devalue really rapidly because of the perceived market sentiment of how AI was going to impact negatively that particular business category. Yeah, AI absolutely has been a game changer. And in the acquisition space, if a business is using AI effectively, it can increase its valuation. And if it's perceived that the business could be completely made obsolete by
Hmm.
AI, that decreases the valuation of the business pretty substantially. So it's a consideration with every business that we deal with.
And a great point there to watch out for. I'm sure listeners are really curious about how we could potentially acquire another business without using up a lot of their cash reserves. Again, I'll ask, is there a framework? I know you referred to creativity, but is there a framework that allows you to be creative, or is it just the constraints of business circumstances that creates that space for creativity?
Yeah, there's somewhat of a framework. You mentioned that we have over 220, I think now we're 230 different ways of funding an acquisition. And the reality is we use 10, 12 of them as the core group, core cluster, and then we add unique ones as needed. So some of the different ways, and I want to make clear one of the things people, when I talk to a business owner about acquisition, say, okay, you're doing $2 million a year in revenue right now. Your objective is to double and do $4 million a year. You find this other $2 million a year business, and what their perception is that, yeah, it's going to cost me $2 million to acquire that business. The reality is, with leveraging funding options, you can usually do an acquisition for 10% of the overall valuation. So you can acquire a $2 million business for $200,000 and have all that cash flow and everything going to you. And so some of the different ways that we use commonly, obviously seller financing, which is sellers provide some semblance of some portion of the financing. Now, I am not out there saying, oh, you buy a business with no money down and the seller will finance it all. Those deals are few and far between, and they're very quite unicorns, but you'll see people promoting that, and that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about reasonable seller financing that mitigates risk for the acquirer as well as provides long-term residual revenue and some great tax benefits for the sellers. But we do things like asset-based financing, where you actually fund against the assets of the business. We do revenue-based financing, where lenders are willing to lend against the revenues of the business. Third-party equity investors. So I talked about one of my earliest deals was backed by private equity. Their private equity firms are looking for deals, and they don't always have to own. Matter of fact, they generally don't love to own the entire business. They like to own a piece of the business, and you can bring them in as equity partners and share equity in a business. There's equipment based financing. There's all sorts of options out there. Those are some of the top five that we use quite a bit. RBF, seller, third-party equity, and a few others. But there's no real set framework that we use. If you really have to be creative and understand the goals and objectives of the business. We've had instances where the management team of the business is interested in staying on even after the owner, the equity ownership is looking at leaving. The management team, maybe they're interested in owning that business, but they weren't able to put together a deal or a funding to let them take over. Guess what? They might be interested in coming in as minority owners. So we've had where two or three members of the management team come in on the deal and they contribute a large portion of the funding to do the deal, and they get equity in the business. And now instead of just being an employee of the business, they are part owners of the business. That's always a wonderful way to structure a deal. Just another way that we get creative with those types of arrangements.
So I'm just thinking through in my head, let's say we were to go with a seller financing option. Looking at acquiring a business is one thing. Creating the kind of 10x returns that you mentioned with your own experience is quite another. Beyond the financing side of things, are we looking for opportunities to either scale that existing acquisition, or is there an element of merging two businesses that successfully that allows for that scale?
It depends on the scenario. Both are effective strategies, and it depends on what your strategic plan is. So sometimes it makes a lot of sense to keep the two businesses separate and at arm's length. Maybe they do business with each other. They exchange relationships and customer data and things like that, but they're two separate identities, two separate brands, etc. Other times it makes more sense to merge the two together into one entity. You get economies of scale with regard to operations and back office and things like that, and one may absorb into the other. It really depends on the scenario that your business is in and the other business is in, what makes the most sense.
With something like a merger, like you did, acquiring a competitor, how would you view this idea of not just acquiring a business, but effectively merging two different cultures in order to create one cohesive unit that allows for the kind of scale that you were able to achieve?
Yeah. So what's the question about that?
How would you think through the actual merger of the two businesses to allow for a culture that allows for the kind of growth that you're really looking for from the very beginning?
Yeah, that's a big question. First of all, you've got to understand what the cultures are. What is your culture and what is their culture? And how do you get to know their culture? You've got to spend time with them. You can't just ask, what's your culture? Because most people, especially at the highest level of business, CEOs and presidents, have truly very little accuracy of the pulse of what their business is really doing, unfortunately. I love spending time with people on the front lines, people on the production line. So your coders, there's always one person in every company who secretly runs the business, and they don't have the title and they don't have the recognition, and they generally don't have the glory, right? But they secretly are running the place. Find that person. Sometimes it could be your client services manager, it could be an operations person, it could be the office manager, it could be the receptionist. You don't know, but find that person. You'll find them by talking to other employees, and you'll start to hear a name come up more often. And you're like, oh, who is this person? Okay, their title isn't CEO, but everything seems to go through them. That happens a lot in businesses. So you need to find that person, take them to lunch, and just ask them open-ended questions and let them talk. And so really get to understand their culture and whether or not there's going to be a fit. If there is a fit, then obviously transparency and communication are important. Anytime there's an acquisition, people tend to panic and get scared, and you run the risk of losing key people because they're worried that they're going to lose their jobs. The reality is some of them might lose their jobs. It just depends on the nature of the acquisition if you have redundant roles. But the ones that you want to keep, you want to make sure that you are being open and communicating effectively with them and what the future holds and being optimistic. For the ones who are worried about losing their jobs, it could be an opportunity for you to prune the tree, as it were. Healthy plants, healthy roses, healthy fruit trees, etc. They need pruning in order to continue to grow and be healthy. And so it could be an opportunity for that to happen organically through the acquisition. But communication, transparency, and truly getting to know the cultures, not just what you're told the culture is by the ownership and the equity group, but what you actually are able to recognize from and talk to customers and clients as well. They'll tell you what the culture is. They know if the slogans or taglines of the company are true or just made up.
A great point there. So in my mind, if I were to acquire a company, I would need to ensure that my company can operate without me in order to allocate my time with this new potential acquisition. I see you nodding. I take it you're in agreement there.
Yeah, very much. And you actually bring about a good point. Is I've had business owners come to me and say, my business is really struggling in this area or that area, and so I want to acquire a business to fill in the gaps there. And I always warn them again: if your business isn't running well, the last thing you should be doing is acquiring another business that you're also going to not run well. Get your house in order first before you start adding more. So you are dead on there.
The other element that came to mind is this idea of communication. Now, with the potential acquisition of another business, if you were to go in and start speaking to some of the staff, as perhaps the CEO of the business that could be acquired, I might get a little concerned because I don't want the value of my business to decrease. I don't want the kind of revenue to decrease. I don't want people's attention being taken away from their day-to-day work and for them to start worrying about, oh, do I need to exit now before this all goes pear-shaped, or etc. How would you recommend we approach communication in order to be fair to both sides of the equation?
Yeah. So first of all, whenever we do an arrangement such as this, it's never discussed that, hey, he's going to come in and talk to the team because they're looking at acquiring the business. It's never that. We generally phrase it as investments. We generally say it's going to come in, they're investors, and they're looking at investing in the business. That gets people excited. It immediately shifts the conversation, right? Oh, they're going to put some money into this. Oh, finally, they're going to inject some cash around here, right? Investors are seen as saviors in some degree, versus acquirers are seen as marauders. So that's one of the ways we do it. We also sometimes go in under the guise of consultation. Hey, we have some consultants coming in, or advisors are going to be chatting with you and asking you some questions. But we never, ever do it as, hey, somebody's interested in buying the company, they're coming to talk to you. That's never a way we do it.
And the other point that came to mind was this idea of culture. While it's certainly good to find that person that secretly runs the business and speak to them to get the nuts and bolts of how things are structured, would I be right in saying that really you're looking to see how much of how much of the values that they espouse are actually bought in by the staff of the company?
Versus what? Directed from
as opposed to just issuing orders and day-to-day directives, quarterly directives.
You can't order and give directives to create values, period. The CEOs think they can. They don't. They never do. The values of the company will evolve with the members of the team. And the executive teams can go away and have an annual retreat and come back with a new mission statement and a new values and statement and all this kind of stuff. The reality is the values of the business are what the people in the business are actually doing every single day in and day out in the trenches. Those are the values of the business. So that's why I said earlier, you could ask the CEO what the values of the company are, and it will be completely different than what the people will tell you if you ask them that are running the trenches. And it's unfortunate. And the bigger the company, the higher likelihood that's going to happen.
How would you recommend companies structure earnouts to minimize risk while maximizing seller engagement?
Yes. So thank you for asking that question. So first of all, you asked how. Let's go back to the first part of what that question is should there be earnouts involved? And absolutely. Earnouts are a big part of a lot of the structures that we put together, because it helps provide security for the acquiring company that what they're buying is truly what they're buying, and there's nothing hiding, and that the revenues, the numbers are going to hit the numbers, etc. And so earnouts are a very critical component that we use. On the other side of that, if you're a company that's being acquired using earnouts, we see a lot of people with resistance to them, but the reality is you should be open to them. We are a big fan of the double-edged earnout, meaning a lot of earnouts are basically, we'll pay you X amount of money, a certain amount of that will be on an earnout, and if these metrics aren't hit, you're not getting that money. That's a standard kind of single directional earnout, right? We try to do earnouts that are bi-directional, meaning here's the amount of money we're going to acquire your company for. As long as if certain metrics aren't met, then that money is going to be dropped down because you will not have earned out this portion. However, if we exceed the numbers, and we love these especially for retained equity deals where the ownership team is not leaving the company. They're going to continue on. We're acquiring the business, but we may be acquiring a minority stake or a majority stake, but they still have a substantial stake and they're staying on. Then I love these kind of earnouts because it says, if we're buying the company for X, we're paying $6 million for your business, but if we don't hit these certain benchmarks, that might only be $5 million. However, if we exceed these benchmarks, then we might actually pay you $7 million for your company. And so everybody wins, right? You as the
Right.
acquiring business are mitigating your risk by having earnouts that protect you on the downside, and the company being acquired can increase the potential of valuation of their deal over time by helping make sure that the numbers are actually exceeded. And we're big fans of that type of earnout structure.
Brilliant. Is there a framework, and if so, what's your framework for evaluating potential revenue synergies before an acquisition?
Potential what energies?
Potential revenue synergies before an acquisition.
I don't know that there's a framework necessarily. Obviously, you're analyzing I guess, simply put, you're looking at will that revenue stay intact after acquisition, and can you enhance that revenue by owning that business? Are the things that you can do to enhance the revenue of that business, and vice versa? Are things that business can bring to the table for you to enhance your revenue? So I don't know that we have a framework so much as it is just answering the question, does this make sense for all parties? And starting with that basis.
There's a lot that needs to be unpacked there, but for the perhaps sake of simplicity, to help some of the listeners wrap their heads around, is there like a playbook for the first 100 days after acquiring a company that you would recommend that they prioritize?
Yes, and your timing is very interesting that you said that first 100 days. I advise my clients for the first 90 days, don't do anything. Don't change anything.
Okay.
So one of the biggest mistakes I see is somebody who acquires a business and immediately goes in and starts changing things and breaks things they didn't even know existed. And charging head on in and saying, okay, we're going to do this and this, and it's a whole new day. You will find that there are things that are happening in that business and processes that are happening in that business that you will break, and you won't even know that they existed beforehand. And so we recommend just spending that time getting to know the business thoroughly and understanding it. If we say 90 days, don't make a single change for 90 days. So you say first 100 days, the playbook is very simple. Don't do anything for 90 of it. And what we recommend during that time is that you spend that time getting to know everybody. Now, obviously, we talked about getting to know the team pre-acquisition and getting to know the culture, et cetera. Now that you're the owner of the business, now you go in depth with that. I recommend as much one-on-one FaceTime as you can get with every single team member across the board, asking questions. And my favorite question to ask during that 90-day process is, and then what? I love the question, and then what? What do you do here? What do you do when a customer calls you? We answer the phone and transfer them to, and then what? Voicemail is probably full, so it's crazy what an and then what can get to. And then what leads to, that's where you start identifying, oh, there's something wrong with this process here. Oh, this is a great process, but not everybody's following it. So we need to make sure that we're documenting that and replicating that in other areas of the business. So spending a lot of time asking every single person on the team, and then what, will yield you incredibly powerful results so that you can understand the business. From that standpoint, then at day 91, then you can start making plans and changing things and tweaking things and modifying things. But again, explaining to communication and clarity and transparency, right? Making sure the team is on board. I'm a big fan of trying to let people think that things are their idea. So we're giving credit where credit's due. So in asking the and then what questions in the first 90 days, you might find a process or procedure that's exponentially powerful in transforming the entire business. If it was John in accounting that kind of led you to that path, bring John up in accounting up and say, this is an idea that John in accounting came up with, and it's going to revolutionize our financial reporting processes, or whatever that might be. Give that credit and recognition and transparency of where that idea came from inside the team, and give that credit. Because if you come in and say, here I am, I'm going to make all these changes because I'm the smartest guy in the room, you're going to get resistance. People are going to, wow, man, who's this person? They just take over the business and now they're just throwing their weight around it. But if you say, we're going to do this change because one of the people who are already on the team had this great idea, it disarms them substantially and increases adoption in its actual, or increases the odds it'll actually be adopted.
Would I be right in also suggesting that even though people would entertain this idea of acquisition to scale their businesses, they should do so with an exit in mind and structure businesses, even their scaling of businesses, with that end goal?
Yes, thank you for bringing that up, because this is something that we really try to get people to think about, and that is that you should always have your business ready to sell, even if you never plan to sell it. Okay. And why is that? The reality is every business owner is going to exit their business someday, period. No matter what. It might be 30 years from now when they retire. It might be 20 years from now when they die, or it might be tomorrow because something might happen that's out of their control. And we talk about in our team the 5 Ds and a B that trigger forced sales. So it's divorce, disease, death, debt, disagreements, or the 5 Ds, and then the B is burnout. And you never know when one of those might strike. And if your business is not in a place where it's attractive to be acquired, you may wind up having to sell under duress or distress, and which could mean minimal valuation. It could mean it would take longer to sell. So you should always have your exit strategy. Long term, the planned exit should always be in your mind. You should always have a plan of what does this look like when I'm ready to exit on my terms. But you should also always have your business ready to exit if something happens tomorrow or in a month or in a year that's not on your terms, that forces you to sell, because quite frankly, it happens all the time. And if you bury your head in the sand like it's not going to happen, then you're one of the people that's going to get caught flat-footed. Keep those 5 Ds and a B in mind, because again, nobody plans for those things. You don't plan on having a fire in your house, but you probably have homeowners insurance. You don't plan on having a car accident, but you probably have auto insurance. You don't plan on selling your business, but what are you doing to ensure yourself that your business is ready to sell if something does happen?
A great points there. Obviously, revenue is a key metric for most businesses, as is perhaps their P&L and cost of acquisition, etc. But are there specific metrics that you would recommend business owners pay more attention to, with the exit in mind and this focus on maximizing their valuations for an exit?
Absolutely. Particularly in SaaS, but in a lot of B2B business sectors, valuations based on revenues have not been completely uncommon in the last several years. Now, 2021, 2022, when free money was everywhere, the promise of revenues and hockey stick growth was enough to provide incredibly stratospheric valuations, regardless of the profitability of that revenue. Those days have changed. The reality is most acquiring businesses are looking to acquire another company that already has cash flow and profitability. So the EBITDA numbers, your cash flow numbers, have become substantially more important than just revenue when valuing a business. The multiples are more and more based on profits than they are on revenues. That's something that in some business sectors, a lot of business owners have just always had that wrong. And in some business sectors, like SaaS, for example, it was right a couple of years ago, and it's getting less right by the day as the market is shifting and people are looking for cash flow over potential. So EBITDA. Something else that I see a lot happening with businesses, and we tend to see this a little bit with smaller businesses, and that is tax mitigation strategies. Meaning, we see business owners who say, I did $5 million in revenue, but I've worked it so that I have no profit to show for it, so I don't have to pay taxes. Well, guess what? If you have a tax mitigation strategy and you are running your business to minimize taxes through the strategy of minimizing profits, you are hamstringing your business. That business is worth substantially less than if you change again, and this is an exit planning thing, right? If you're truly planning to exit, then you need, at least over a 3-year span, you need to be changing and working with your finance department and your tax advisors and say, I need to switch from a tax mitigation strategy to a profit maximization strategy, because every dollar I save in taxes might save me, or excuse me, every dollar in profit that I can wipe out might save me 25% in taxes, right? But every dollar in profit that I don't have when I'm ready to sell that might be a 3x value, a 4x, a 5x. So you have $1 in profit and you're working really hard to save 20 cents and you're leaving $5 on the table. And that is something I see business owners do all the time. And that's something that they, once I explain it to business owners, they, oh my gosh, yeah, that makes all the sense in the world. But for some reason, people aren't really sharing that knowledge. So I'm glad you asked that question.
Intellectual property. It's, to me, a bit of a grey area in terms of how you value it, and tech assets as well, especially given the changing environment we're living in today. What would you suggest to people who are trying to get their heads around that idea?
Yeah, you said it's a gray area. It is as gray as it can be. You're absolutely right about that. It's a very gray area. So intellectual property is very difficult to value. So you might have a piece of tech that cost $500,000 to develop. And so the owner of that tech who's trying to sell it, let's say they were trying to sell it as an asset, as an intellectual property asset, may look at it and say, I need to at least recoup my investment into that plus a profit. So I spent $500,000 on this. I need to sell it for $1,000,000. The potential acquirer of that tech or that intellectual property may look at it and say, if I own it, my upside on this is maybe $250,000 a year, and I won't even recoup my investment on that for 4 years. That's not worth it to me. I want to recoup my investment faster. They also look at the replicatability of that text. Is that something that, okay, you created it, but how hard would it be to recreate it in a different form? Even if it's patented, even if there are patents and copyrights in the code or the intellectual property, can that just be changed a small amount and then you can go around the patent? It happens all the time. Intellectual property is one of those really interesting areas that can be quite tricky, because the dictionary definition of value is the amount that a buyer is willing to pay and the amount that a seller is willing to sell for, and what do those come to, and that's the true value. And it's a very interesting exercise to value intellectual property in a way that you're trying to gauge the marketplace and say, okay, this is what we believe that buyers would be willing to pay, and this is what we believe a seller is willing to sell it for, and then you got to work hard to get it right. But the reality is it's quite difficult to get it right. I work with a lot of clients who have, again, in the tech space and the B2B space, that intellectual property is a big part of their business. They've got tech, they've got proprietary intellectual property that does have the value. So generally, we're assigning value against the outcome of that intellectual property. So just because you created something, if it's never been used and it's never actually had application and people haven't actually proven it out, it maybe have some value, but the reality is the marketplace is probably going to look at that as having very little value. So taking a piece of intellectual property and saying, here's this piece of intellectual property, and people are willing to license it for X amount of money, or they're willing to other investment or other monetization of that intellectual property, then that really shows that, oh, okay, this is a piece of intellectual property that has value, that has recognition in the marketplace, either monetarily or from a brand standpoint. When we talk about what's the most valuable piece of intellectual property in the world, is the Coca-Cola logo, right? It's worth billions and billions of dollars as a piece of intellectual property. Why is it worth billions and billions of dollars? Because they've sold billions of dollars worth of product on the back of that piece of intellectual property. If you just drew out the Coca-Cola logo, even if it took you a year of sweat and blood and tears to draw that logo out and show it to somebody and say, here, I've put a year of my life into creating this logo, is it worth billions of dollars, even if it was the exact same? No, because Coca-Cola has proven that intellectual property out by selling around the world billions of dollars worth of their products against that intellectual property. So does that help?
Thank you for that. I feel as though we've probably just touched the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, in terms of the areas that we could explore with this idea of scaling a business through acquisition. But I'm curious, in this area of growth through acquisition, do you find there's perhaps a couple of areas that doesn't get much airtime, doesn't get talked about very much? If so, what would they be?
You've done a really great job of uncovering some of those, actually. Like we talked about what truly values a business and what metrics, which allowed me to talk about tax mitigation strategies versus profit maximization. We talked about having an exit strategy for your business, even if it's unplanned, that's really one of my most important points that I want to get across, is that And the reason I'm so passionate about it is because I get calls every single week. Every single week, I'm not exaggerating, from somebody that says, "Hey, I've got this business. I'm now in this situation that I wasn't expecting, and now there needs to be an exit." And the reality is that sometimes those stories are horrible. I'll give you one story, and this is not a B2B story, but it's something that happened in real life just recently. I had a woman call me, and she said, "My husband is a plumber. He has a plumbing business, and he has passed on. He told me that a business is worth 3 times its revenue when you sell it. And he didn't really have much life insurance. We weren't financially prepared for him to pass on. It was very sudden.
Mm-hmm.
And his business is doing about $500,000 a year in revenue. And so I need to sell this business for $1.5 million." And I said, "Okay, let me ask you some questions. So how many employees did this business have?" And she said, "It really wasn't any employees. It was just him." Okay. Where did you get the $1.5 million valuation from? He read that somewhere in a business journal that most businesses get 3 times revenues. So that's what I need. I need $1.5 million. I said, "Okay. What kind of assets does the business have?" "It's got a truck and some tools and equipment." "Okay. What's that worth?" "Well, the truck's 7-8 years old and blah, blah." "Okay. So you got about $30,000 worth of equipment." And he was the business. And I had to break the news to this person that, contrary to her belief that the business was worth $1.5 million, it really was worth zero. It was essentially worth nothing. And that was such an incredible shock to her. And I didn't relish having to give that information out and give that news out. But the reality is, there are millions of business owners around the world who could be in the same position, and they're completely unprepared. So they should be looking now. What is my business truly worth? What is it valued at? If I have to exit now, what's going to happen? If I want to exit in 5 years, how do I make that exit happen so that I get what I want with regard to the outcome, whether that be financial, lifestyle, etc.? How do I plan and prepare for that? And so that's my biggest takeaway that you've been able to draw out on this talk, which I really appreciate, is that people need to be thinking about this stuff. They think that buying and selling businesses and acquisitions is for the big Wall Street firm. They think of an airline buying another airline, or banks buying banks, or big tech companies acquiring other tech companies. Acquisitions are at every level of business, regardless of what the size of your business is, what the industry you're in. These are things you should be thinking about, whether you should be acquiring other businesses or what you're going to do to have your business acquired on your terms.
Brilliant. I love it. Marty, if listeners are curious, want to find out more or connect with you, where would you recommend they head to?
Oh, sure. So there's 2 places to find me most easily for this. One is my website at westboundroad.com. And there's contact information there. You can get a hold of me. I'm also very active on LinkedIn under Marty Fahncke. I'm the only Marty Fahncke in the entire world. So if you can figure out how to spell my name based on typing it out here, or if you're seeing the podcast notes or something like that, or if you are listening, it's Fahncke. I'm the only Marty Fahncke in the world, so I'm easy to find. I'm very proud of the fact that I'm easy to find, because thousands of results will come back when you type my name, and they're all positive. And I'm very proud of that we do great work for our clients and our partners and our investors, and we try and make wonderful things happen. And we're always willing to help anybody as much as we possibly can.
And to make things easier, we'll include links in the show notes so
Awesome.
people can find you easily. Marty, this has been brilliant. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me. It's been an absolute honor and a pleasure to be here.